Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Heather, should we start officially?
Yeah, go ahead. Yep, let's do it.
Right? Thanks so much for your time. I know it's August, it's a holiday time, but thanks so much for making your time for tea time chat.
Well, anytime talking about pilgrimage is inspiring, so I'm happy to do it any month of the year.
Really? But you're the pilgrimage professor, so I was so happy you agreed to join this tea time chat. And you've been writing so many interesting things about pilgrimage. I read a couple of newspaper articles, leisure and travel, right? Travel and leisure.
Travel, that's right.
Travel and leisure, and yeah, so many interesting things. So Heather, before we start our official conversation, how did you start and why did you start studying pilgrimage as a researcher?
I think that I can't separate the study of pilgrimage from my previous history as a mental health therapist. So I spent many years working in as a therapist with in mental health organizations, and I think that this set the stage for me to start thinking about what is therapeutic and how does healing occur and how does well-being occur, uh, and and what types of activities could happen outside of a therapist's office that would be therapeutic or healing or lead to well-being. So I think that I was primed for the study of pilgrimage by being a therapist, first of all. So during my PhD studies, I took a trip to Israel in 2010. And while I was preparing to take this trip, I read a book about the history of the Middle East, which was written by a man called Bernard Lewis. And in this book, he talked about that pilgrimage is important for all Middle East cultures. And I didn't really know what pilgrimage was. I was not raised in a religious tradition where pilgrimage was a strong part of the tradition. So for me, the word had a religious connotation, but it did not have a personal. I was not personally connected to the term or to the concept of pilgrimage. But I thought, since I was going to Israel, that I would take the opportunity to observe people around me and look at others sort of through this pilgrimage lens to see what I could learn about pilgrimage and pilgrims in Israel and in the Middle East. And so this was probably the easiest piece of informal research that I'd ever done because there are pilgrims everywhere. So even at certain sites, there are different types of pilgrims that are approaching the site from different lenses. They bring different meaning, even different religious traditions to that site. And so it was a really rich experience in terms of pilgrimage and being able to observe how pilgrims engage with sites. So I observed Jewish pilgrims, Muslim pilgrims, Christian pilgrims, Baha'i pilgrims, and even pilgrims that were visiting sites like Masada as part of their training in the Israel Defense Force. So groups go to this site as part of their training, and it's called a pilgrimage. But the most significant experience happened at a place called Latrun, which is a strategic hillside overlooking the road between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. And I had gone to this site because it was interesting, but also because it was a contrast to the kind of the congestion of Jerusalem, and I was feeling very kind of suffocated by how busy the bustle and the tension of the old city. And so went outside the city for a bit, and I was sitting on this very large boulder at Latrun, and I looked over and saw two older gentlemen who were walking up near me, and they were talking to each other. They were weeping. They were drinking vodka or some type of alcohol. And based on the fact that this site is a military, is part of a kind of historical military number of battles have occurred there, I started thinking maybe these were veterans of the Six Day War in 1967, And whether they were or not isn't so important. I think what is important is that I started conceptualizing pilgrimage as something that can certainly be religious, but can also be non-religious, but very significant to an individual for reasons that we may or may not know. So this really made an impact on me to see how these older gentlemen were connecting with the site and what it might mean for them. I didn't speak to them, so I don't know for sure what it meant, but the idea that pilgrimages can happen because of something that the individual brings to a site really impacted me quite profoundly. And certainly the work I'm doing now is very much tied back to that experience in 2010. So when I returned from Israel, my PhD work shifted immediately to looking at how these pilgrimages and how pilgrimages in general can be therapeutic, or they can be healing, or they can lead to well-being. And so I interviewed a number of people for my PhD dissertation, and then kind of developed this grounded theory about why pilgrimages are healing endeavors.
Really fascinating. And Heather, like, I mean, I was researching a little bit of pilgrimage, but I come from tourism background, and you come from psychology and more therapeutic background, and it's kind of like something like similar in a way, like therapeutic for people and well-being, wellness. It's so really interesting. And we met at a pilgrimage conference 7 years ago.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Oh, that's how we connected. So it's so really interesting. But Heather, as a pilgrimage researcher, what has been most interesting or phenomenal to you with the pilgrimage phenomenon during COVID time in the past 1.5 years?
Oh, it's an interesting question that I've given a lot of thought to, because people ask it. I mean, it's been asked, right? You've probably been part of conferences over the past 18 months where this question is posed: what is changing? And I think uh, probably even more so from a tourism perspective, we don't know fully how this is changing. We don't know yet, but I think that what I'm seeing is that COVID and the pandemic have there's been a situation of almost a ultra routine where we are nothing changes in some ways. We go from work or school or life, and we're sitting in front of a computer, or we're in the same physical space, whether that's a home or wherever we are, right? We've been in this sort of contained space. So I think, I mean, there's strong precedence for the idea that people think about pilgrimages when they're trapped or contained or stifled in some way. The work I'm doing around World War I pilgrimages gives insight into this, where very often the soldiers who were on the Western Front of World War I were thinking about pilgrimages and how people would come back to that space once the war was over. So I think that there's something interesting that happens from a psychological perspective, where we contrast difficult circumstances, challenging circumstances. I mean, certainly we are not in the midst of a war right now. At least I'm not in the midst of a war. Other people on the earth right now are in the midst of conflict. But I do think there's something where we think about an escape, where there's peace, where we can find meaning, where it's calm. And so I think that during the pandemic, it's been natural to think about how we might go on a pilgrimage once we are out of this state of containment.
But Heather, in the States, you think people have gone to pilgrimage sites more domestically, or there hasn't been much change?
I do think that people are visiting sites that are close to home or close to wherever they've been quarantined. So this is a change that I think that will come out of the pandemic. You know, I've been noticing sites or seeing sites that are near my home in a different way that I probably would overlook had I not been close by. So I know that many people are finding even sacred natural sites that are close by, whether that be, you know, rock formations or a lake or a stream or mountains, and engaging with these natural sites in a way that they may not have pre-COVID.
So people are going to more like secular sites, and there are like new forms of like secular pilgrimages emerging, or
I think so. I think, you know, it's interesting, this continuum of secular sacred, uh, because as you know, I mean, you and Michael's book addresses this, you know, sort of who sanctions pilgrimages, whether they're official, whether they're not official. And so I do think that there's it's become very murky, the differentiation between a secular pilgrimage and a sacred pilgrimage. And I always come back to, I mean, my focus is on the individual pilgrim. So I'm really at this micro level looking at the experiences of individual pilgrims. So I think that the meaning that's ascribed to sites by individuals, I don't see a lot of difference between a person who has maybe religious motivations and someone who doesn't have, you know, who has non-religious motivations. There really isn't a lot of difference in how the pilgrimage is pursued or approached.
So do you think in the post-COVID time, people will go to more pilgrimage sites for mental well-being issue, or people are more
I do
interested?
think I do think that I think that people have I think we're reconceptualizing pilgrimage, and even places that we may not have considered as pilgrimage sites are becoming pilgrimage sites because of that hard line between being contained and being in, you know, sort of the routine has become this ultra routine. So anything outside of that almost feels like a sacred journey. I mean, I'm even thinking about the first time that I went to a meeting for work outside of where I currently am. It felt different. I approached it differently. It was almost, I don't think I would say that it was sacred, but it was approached very differently than just going to a meeting outside of my house pre-COVID. So I think we are valuing travel experiences differently, and maybe we're reprioritizing and reconceptualizing what travel looks like. And so I do think that even if people may not be going to sites that are traditional pilgrimage sites, they are likely categorizing their travel in a new way, and one of these new ways is as a pilgrimage.
Yeah, I agree. Like I traveled to Ireland a few weeks ago, but before it was just normal thing to visit in-law, but this time was really different. It was not, I wouldn't say sacred, but it almost felt like really, really meaningful, and sacred is more,
Yes,
yeah, very, it was something more meaningful, and I was more nicer to my in-laws, you know. It was more like my value changes, and the priority changes, right? So yeah, that's all
that's right.
interesting, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
But pilgrimage sites or pilgrimages will have more challenges in the post-COVID time, or even opportunities would they have because of COVID?
I think going back to the idea of people traveling to sacred natural sites or sites that are in nature, you know, I think that there are opportunities for the communities that may be close to these sites or along these routes. There are a number of pilgrimage routes or trails that are popping up all over the world. So I think that there's an opportunity there for the communities and the people, the local people who are living nearby, in terms of creating some type of infrastructure for the number of people who will be traveling along these routes or to these sites. And at the same time, I think the issue of conservation rises to the fore, because these sites they may not have had the mass numbers of people that are about to traverse to these sites. And so I think that we need to be mindful about how we leave the sites, and in ensuring that the conservation practices are in place so that there can be sustainability long term, at these natural sites.
Yeah, definitely. We just talked about it earlier. Even in the UK, people go to this pilgrimage walks more. And I've noticed,
Yes.
I mean, in Wales right now, and the hotels are all just fully booked this summer because of, English people come to Wales instead of Spain, they go to these walks. So there'll be not over tourism, but there'll be some issues around the pilgrimage sites because more demand in these destinations. So they must be mindful with sustainability issues, definitely, right? Something to be kind of mindful of, right? But
That's right. And I think there's also, some level of concern. This is not my area of expertise, but I do think about it with the influx of pilgrims or tourists into these places that up to this point may not have had this level of tourism. I think this type of bubble, it may not be sustainable. So I think that this needs to be considered as well, the impact on the local economy and the sustainability of some of these routes, because right now pilgrimage and walking, they're fads. They're very popular. People want to get out and walk, and as I said, there are these routes that, as you know, they're popping up all over the world, new marked trails and routes. And so I don't know how long this is going to last. I would like to think that it will last a long time, and I don't know that that is actually realistic.
Heather, but actually, I read this newspaper article like several times. I think your interviews in there somewhere, but it says pilgrimage will be the most popular form of
Yes.
tourism, right? Or would you agree with that? It will be most popular form of tourism, really?
I think, I mean, certainly I'm biased because I studied pilgrimage and I've been studying pilgrimages and pilgrims for the past 10 years. And so I'm very close to the issue of pilgrimage and the phenomenon of pilgrimage and the experiences of pilgrims. And so I do think that people are traveling in different ways. People want meaning. Because of being contained, because of our lives being so uniform, I think people also have had opportunities to look inward and think about and ponder what is important, what priorities they have. And so the ability to travel in a way that sort of manifests or makes congruent the external world with the internal world, I think is important, and pilgrimages are a way to do that.
I definitely agree. I'm actually one of those people. During COVID, I totally changed my priorities, and I think of meaning in life a lot, and I switched jobs during this time. So I'm sure not only me, more people thinking of really meaning of life and what's important in life, right? So obviously
Yeah,
people,
definitely.
yeah.
I've been reading a bit about how many people have so many people are doing research online about different aspects of identity, whether that is where the origin maybe of their family, or in cases of immigrant populations where that ancestral homeland is, or even developing a new hobby and kind of tracing the origin of that. So I think that people have had this like incubation time of doing individual or meaningful research about some element of identity. And I think that we're going to see people then acting and initiating travel to sites that they've discovered might be important parts of their own identity.
I think that's exactly what I did. For the first time in 16, 17 years, I went back home to South Korea, and I stayed there for like 10 months, and I started visiting these local Buddhist temples, and it was really big for me, just thinking about like who I am as identity and reconnecting to my culture. So that was quite, I wouldn't say healing, but little bit therapeutic in a way, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So going back to your kind of original, the therapeutic pilgrimages, do you have any insights on wellness tourism or for wellness tourism destinations from this pilgrimage trends in the
I think I can
post-COVID?
offer some thoughts.
Yeah.
Again, I'm not a tourism researcher. You probably have many more thoughts around the concept of wellness tourism. But I think I can offer a bit of a perspective here. We often in psychology talk about a holistic healing or a kind of the integration of our biological, psychological, social, and spiritual domains kind of integrating together. And so I think that when I think about wellness tourism, that's what I think of. I think of opportunities that are focused on this integration. A few years ago, I published a book about pilgrimage being transformational pilgrimage as a transformative process. And the mechanism that I identified for this transformation has to do with integration and sort of the integration from many fractured pieces, which often happens on a pilgrimage journey. So I think from a tourism perspective, the sites or the programs that offer some type of integrative experience, I think are going to be those are going to be appealing to people, especially as we rediscover who we are. We find parts of our identity that seem more important than before the pandemic. I think people are going to be looking for external experiences that help them integrate all these parts of ourselves.
I definitely agree. Yeah, something like package it with something more meaningful activities beyond, yoga and luxury
Yes.
spas. So yeah,
Yep.
definitely agree. Yeah. And Heather, during this pandemic time, have you gone for any pilgrimage yourself?
I have,
Yeah.
and my experience has paralleled what I've been talking about. I became interested about 18 months ago in World War One pilgrimages, and in particular the Western Front Way, which is a new long distance trail that crosses Belgium and France. And I wasn't really a war historian or even amateur historian, nor did I have explicit interest in the First World War. However, because of pilgrimage, I have started learning a lot about it. I two of my great grandfathers were in the First World War One, at least, or in the First World War. At least one of them was in France fighting. I'm not sure about about the second. So there's a part of my own family history that I started doing research on and wanted to know more about that. And so in doing this, I slowly started learning about the long history of pilgrimages that happened to the Western Front of World War One. Really starting, some of them happened during the war to specific battle sites, but the majority happened in the 1920s and 1930s, and there were many pilgrimage guidebooks that were published, which I have slowly been acquiring and poring over because it gives so much insight into what veterans were thinking about. These pilgrimages were for the veterans of the war. And so, also in the process of the past year and a half, I received a grant from New Hampshire Humanities, where I live, to create a
Congratulations.
a virtual pilgrimage, kind of a digital archive of sites that were important to the U.S. Army's 26th Division, which was known as the Yankee Division. And the soldiers in this division were all from New England states, so they're very much tied to New Hampshire and other New England states. And so certainly my interest in this virtual space is tied to the pandemic. I don't know that I would have considered virtual pilgrimage before this, but then thinking about how we can engage from a pilgrimage perspective in a digital way or a virtual way really came to the fore. So that project came out of the pandemic. But in doing the research around the specific pilgrimage sites and then getting into the stories of the individual soldiers who fought and many who died during the First World War, I've become really attached to many of these soldiers. And so I had the opportunity to visit their graves, to visit other sites that were significant to them while they were serving in the war. And so this research then sort of met reality when I was able to visit the sites. So very much these sites were places of pilgrimage for me, because they were connected to the research I was doing, but even more so, they were connected to the people that I've been learning about.
Wow, that's fascinating. So this is your current project, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I'm working on this virtual pilgrimage that's tied to the Yankee division, but very broadly, I'm looking at pilgrimages that occurred to the Western Front from the time of the end of the war, basically up to current time. Many people are going back now, oftentimes inspired by learning about a family member who had served or died in the war, and now they want more information, or people are wanting to connect. Maybe they served in the same unit or another unit in recent military conflicts and are wanting to connect with that unit history from World War I. So there's a lot of interesting sites that are places of pilgrimage for Americans, but also for Germans, for Australians, for French people, for British people. And I think that being able to see these sites of war from a pilgrimage perspective gives a different lens, and it allows for individual meaning versus national narratives, which are often very prominent in commemoration. This gives the individual perspective and how individuals made meaning of the war and what was prioritized for the individual, which is right up my alley, of being interested in the lived experiences of people and pilgrims.
Oh, that's really interesting. But actually, speaking of a virtual pilgrimage, I've seen that has been emerging during COVID time, right? Some other sites.
Yes, there's
You,
so many of them that
right?
are
Yeah,
emerging. I mean, I've
right.
seen they're popping up. I mean, there's Holy Land virtual pilgrimages. There's been virtual pilgrimages to Lourdes in France and other places. I think there have been some virtual Hajj
Oh
experiences.
yeah, I've seen that.
So definitely we are seeing this in many religious traditions and many different types of pilgrimages.
Right. Do you think this will continue even in the post-COVID time? The
I do
virtual.
think it's going to continue.
Mm.
I think that people have connected to these sites or connected to their own faith or connected with other people in a way that has been very significant and meaningful. And so I do think that we, at some level, I think virtual pilgrimage is here to stay. And I think it's opened up the access for people who may not have, well, who can't travel for whatever reason. They can still connect with these sites that are really significant for the individual without having to leave their home. Again, there's lots of chatter, at conferences, academic conferences, around whether virtual pilgrimage is actually a pilgrimage, and I don't think that is. I think that it's irrelevant what we as academics think about it. I think that if the individual sees it as a pilgrimage, we have to look at it as a pilgrimage.
I definitely agree. Yeah. Whatever they say, it is, right? We cannot really define
Yes,
for them. Yeah, I definitely
right.
agree. Yeah. Heather, it's been really, really fascinating chatting with you about pilgrimage during COVID time. Do you have anything else to add for pilgrimage and COVID?
No, I don't think so. I think this has been wonderful, and I look forward to ongoing conversations. We will probably have a lot to talk about in 1 year's time. Things will change so much, and it will be good to reconnect.
Definitely. Heather, and before you go, do you want to introduce your new upcoming book on pilgrimage?
Sure, I would love to. The book is part of a series called Pilgrimage Studies, which I'm the series editor for, published by Peter Lang. We actually have 3 new volumes that are going to be published over the next few months. One of them is my edited book called Multidisciplinary Perspectives on Pilgrimage. You are a chapter contributor. You've contributed the tourism perspectives on pilgrimage. And the book is a new look at pilgrimage from different academic perspectives, academic disciplines or fields of study. Not all of them are disciplines. And so we're looking at pilgrimage through the existing literature on pilgrimage, or literature, even if the discipline doesn't have overt literature on pilgrimage, maybe some of the literature that can be applied to the study of pilgrimage, some theoretical considerations, methodological considerations, and then recommendations for the future. And I'm particularly excited about this book because there are a number of chapters that tackle the topic of pilgrimage where we have not seen this before. So we have a chapter on public administration, for example, and I'm learning so much about pilgrimage actually editing this book, because it's been completely fascinating to see how different people have brought in the literature from their discipline or their academic field of study to the topic of pilgrimage. Information studies, digital humanities, of course, tourism, which you have contributed. I'm contributing a chapter on psychology perspectives, which psychology has not actually taken a solid look at pilgrimage up to this point. So I'll be presenting some thoughts about how we can look at this from a psychological perspective. And the contributors are fascinating people, and have submitted really solid work. So the book should be published later in 2021. And very much looking forward to maybe we can have some type of online forum for all the contributors to talk about their work, because it's been really interesting to see how people can take a different lens and then bring pilgrimage into where they are academically. So very much looking forward to the release of the book.
Yeah, I'm really excited to read this book. I think it's really meaningful. It's fantastic to have these chapters from all different disciplines. And some of the disciplines, the researchers are studying pilgrimage, but I never really read, like public administration or IT.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And what's interesting, Jay, is the overlap in ways that I didn't necessarily see. And so I've been able to look in editing the chapters, see, oh, there's a link here between, geography and public administration. So it's been really interesting too, to be able to see this cross-pollination where even methodologically, many of us are doing something similar or conceptualizing the study of pilgrimage in a similar way, but we have not been talking about that. Just because we haven't had these forums. So it's going to be a really interesting way of moving the conversation forward, I think, in terms of collaborations and meeting new colleagues and thinking about the possibilities for how we can understand pilgrimage and the experiences of pilgrims.
Yeah, definitely. Well, congratulations in advance, Heather. Thank you so much, Heather. This was really, really interesting. It was just perfect.
Thank you.
The timing as well.
I look forward to talking soon.
Me too. Take care. Thank you so much, Heather. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.